NATO just pulled the trigger. The 77-year peace is officially over. That's the kind of headline that grabs your throat, because it implies something massive, that NATO just crossed a line it can't uncross, and we're now in a new era. But here's the problem. That headline is doing what viral headlines always do. It takes one real event, and then it sells you a conclusion that sounds inevitable. So let's do this properly, because this is one of those moments where if you misunderstand what happened, you'll misunderstand what comes next. In the next few minutes, I'm going to give you a simple framework to understand what NATO actually did, why it matters, why it does not automatically mean world war, and what signals to watch that tell you whether this becomes a contained defensive chapter or something much bigger. And I'm going to give you the mini payoff right now, early. What happened wasn't NATO declaring war. What happened was NATO's air and missile defense being used to stop a real incoming threat headed toward a NATO member, Turkey, during an expanding regional war. That's a trigger pull, but it's a defensive one. And that distinction is the entire story. Here's what's been widely reported. Turkey said NATO air defenses intercepted an Iranian ballistic missile that was headed toward Turkish airspace after it crossed Iraqi and Syrian airspace, with the intercept occurring over the eastern Mediterranean. No casualties were reported. The Washington Post. Now let's talk about why people are calling this the end of 77 years of peace. Because the phrase is emotionally powerful, but it's also sloppy. NATO is 77 years old, yes. It was founded in 1949. NATO. And NATO has been involved in combat operations before. So, peace is not a clean, literal description of NATO's entire history. What's different here is the nature of the moment. An Iranian ballistic missile heading toward a NATO member's airspace, and NATO defensive systems engaging it in real time. The Washington Post. WAM. That's why this feels like a threshold. Not because NATO suddenly became a war alliance overnight, but because the conflict environment is now close enough to NATO territory that NATO's defensive posture is being activated in a way the public can easily understand. Missile in the air, intercept in the air. And here's the truth people hate because it removes the drama. This is what NATO is built to do. NATO is a defensive alliance. Its entire point is collective defense and deterrence, especially against threats to member territory. NATO. So, the right question is not, did NATO pull the trigger? The right question is, what does this change? Because in geopolitics, the action matters, but the reaction matters more. So let's break down what it changes, in 3 layers. First, it changes the psychology. When people see NATO intercepting a missile headed toward Turkey, it makes the war feel closer to Europe, even if the missile never reached Turkish airspace, and even if Article 5 isn't invoked. The Washington Post. And that perception shift affects politics, markets, and decision-making. Second, it changes deterrence math. Iran doesn't need to hit Turkey to create pressure. A missile headed that direction, intercepted or not, forces NATO to tighten posture, increase readiness, and signal boundaries. The Washington Post. Third, it changes escalation risk. Not because NATO wanted a fight, but because every additional actor and system in a crowded environment increases the chance of miscalculation, and this is where the internet gets dangerous. Because now you're going to see 2 lazy narratives fighting for control of your attention. Narrative 1. This is World War. It's over. It's inevitable. Narrative 2. This is nothing. It's just PR. Ignore it. Both are emotional. Both can be wrong. The adult reality is in the middle. A defensive intercept is serious, but it's not automatically the same thing as NATO launching an offensive campaign or invoking collective defense. In fact, reporting quotes U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth saying the intercept is unlikely to trigger Article 5, the Washington Post, and that matters because Article 5 isn't a meme. It's a legal and political mechanism. NATO has invoked it only once after 9/11. NATO. So if you want to understand whether the peace is over, stop staring at the headline and watch these 3 signals instead. Signal 1. Does NATO posture shift from defensive readiness to offensive intent? Defensive readiness looks like more air defense deployments, more patrols, protection of member territory, and increased coordination. Offensive intent looks like sustained NATO strikes, NATO-led campaigns, or formal commitments to expand military action beyond defense. Right now, what's publicly being described is defensive action and defensive posture, adjusting forces to counter potential threats, particularly missiles and drones. Al Arabiya English. Signal 2. Does the incident become repeatable? One intercept is a moment. Repeated incidents, multiple missiles, multiple near entries, multiple intercepts, create political pressure for harder responses, because at some point, even a defensive story can force a policy shift. Signal 3. Does the conflict's geography expand to NATO territory in a way that creates casualties or damage? In this reported intercept, there were no casualties and no reported major damage in Turkey. The Washington Post. That matters because escalation thresholds change when bodies and damage appear on alliance territory. Now, let's address the phrase, NATO pulled the trigger. What does that actually mean? It means the alliance's integrated air and missile defense, through deployed assets, engaged an incoming ballistic missile. That's a chain. Detect, track, identify, decide, engage. And this is the part people don't understand about modern defense. It's not one person choosing war. It's a system responding to a timeline measured in seconds. If a ballistic missile is heading toward a NATO member's airspace, the decision window is tiny. That's why these systems exist. And here's another detail that matters. Multiple reports describe the intercept as happening over the eastern Mediterranean, involving NATO defenses, and in some reporting, a U.S. Navy destroyer conducting the intercept. The Washington Post. That adds another layer. NATO doesn't always act as a single thing. It acts through member assets, coordinated under alliance posture. Now, why does Turkey matter so much in this story? Because Turkey is a NATO member with a long border with Iran, and it sits at the edge of multiple conflict zones. That makes it the kind of country where spillover risk isn't theoretical. And Turkish officials have been urging restraint while also emphasizing defense of their airspace, because they're in the blast radius of escalation even if they don't want to be. AL Monitor. So if you're trying to understand the 77-year peace line, here's the cleanest way to interpret it without getting fooled. This isn't about NATO suddenly becoming aggressive. It's about the war's perimeter expanding enough that NATO's defensive shield is being tested in the open. That's the threshold. And that's why your feed feels like it's yelling. Now, let me give you the one mistake people make right here, because this is how you get manipulated. They confuse a single dramatic event with a permanent new reality. They hear intercept, and they jump straight to NATO is now at war. But war isn't a single intercept. War is sustained intent, sustained operations, and sustained escalation across time. So treat this moment for what it is, a serious defensive intercept that increases tension, increases readiness, and increases the risk of miscalculation. But does not automatically equal peace is over forever. Now, what happens next? 3 realistic paths. Path 1. Containment. More defensive deployments, more coordination, tighter posture, but the alliance keeps the line clear. Defend members, avoid widening the war. Path 2. Repetition and hardening. More attempted strikes near NATO airspace, more intercepts, more friction, until political pressure forces stronger declarations and the risk of escalation rises. Path 3. Miscalculation spiral. A missile fragments over land, causes casualties, a strike hits the wrong place, a response comes too fast, and suddenly decisions are being made under panic instead of strategy. That third path doesn't require anyone to be irrational. It only requires a crowded environment and a shrinking decision window. And that's why this moment matters. Not because the headline is dramatic, but because it shows how close the system is operating to the edge. So here's what I want from you. Do you think this is the start of a repeating pattern? More missiles testing NATO's perimeter? Or a one-off spillover moment that gets contained by posture and diplomacy? Drop your take. Sources: Turkey and multiple outlets reporting NATO interception of an Iranian ballistic missile headed toward Turkish airspace. The Washington Post. NATO on Article 5 and collective defense, NATO. NATO adjusting forces to counter potential threats.